You're an agribusiness executive navigating an increasingly competitive market while trying to grow your company. Mergers and acquisitions are pitched as an accelerant to growth, but many M&A deals destroy more value than they create. Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches for successful mergers and acquisitions. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Hello and welcome to the only show on the internet dedicated to helping leaders of small to middle market food and agribusiness firms improve their performance and achieve profitable long-term growth and better execution. This is the Pacesetter Pod, and I'm your host, Joe Mosier. Today we have the just absolute great fortune to be joined by Garrett Stoerger from Verdant Partners. And for those of you who are regular listeners, if you don't know who Verdant Partners is, you need to know. So I'm going to spend just a minute introducing them before I talk about Garrett specifically. Verdant Partners is a leading M&A advisory and consulting business that is hyper-focused on global food and agribusiness. And some quick facts I think they're interesting about Verdant. They're founded in 1998. They're based in Champaign, Illinois. And so this year they're celebrating their 25th anniversary, which is really exciting for them and the team. And during that time, they've successfully managed transactions and strategic alliances that are valued at more than $3 billion US. So really a significant amount of deal volume and deal value over that last 2.5 decades. Verdant's business is all about advising privately held and publicly traded companies to develop and execute their strategy, a topic that's near and dear to my heart. But this for them really includes helping clients acquire or divest of assets, pursue licensing technologies, and collaborating with other businesses in pursuit of their growth. Now let's talk a little bit about Garrett. So Garrett's been involved in agriculture his entire life. He grew up on a grain farm in Illinois. He started his career at University of Illinois Extension, where he was a program educator, and he really specialized in agricultural production operations, agribusiness management, and financial management. And in 2009, Garrett joined Verdant as an associate, where he did market research, market analysis, and project support. 4 years later, in 2013, he was promoted and took on more business development and transaction management duties, and was later then made a partner in 2015. And then earlier this year, it was really exciting to see that Garrett was actually named the firm's managing partner. So Garrett, congratulations on all the success of Verdant. Congratulations on your own success within the firm. Thank you for spending time with us today, and welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Joe, thank you. It's great to be here, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Fantastic. Well, buckle in, everybody, because we've got a lot of stuff that we want to talk about here today. And so, Garrett, I'm going to kick this off first with the notion, really something I believe deeply, is that M&A in and of itself is not a strategy. It's a lever of strategy that companies can pull in service of their growth. In your long experience in this field and in this discipline and practice, what has been your experience in helping lead companies through growth via a merger or acquisition?
I think the key anytime we take on a new client project is to understand where they're coming at this M&A project from in terms of an experience base. If this is their first time going through a process, which you and I have had the pleasure of actually working collaboratively on a project that is exactly that, where it's the first acquisition of a multi-decade, multi-generational family business, for them, it's just fraught with uncertainty. So around every corner, they don't know what to expect. So I think there's a lot of foreground work that needs to be done on situations like that, Joe, where you must first understand that these are companies that are somewhat maybe uncertain, definitely even uneasy about the process. And so getting them just a mindset of what to expect, and that it might be a bumpy road along the way, just getting them with a basic understanding. For the corporate clients of the world who have been down the M&A path on multiple occasions, generally, we're fairly specialized in the line of work we do. And so generally for us, it's just giving them some sort of a level set on expectations of how many opportunities are out there that maybe fit their criteria. What is the likely expectation in terms of positive reactions to an outreach? And then sort of you build and curate the rest of the M&A strategy around that. And then lastly, one comment I would just make, and this is just something that's been maybe it's part of the post-COVID era issue, but finding talent that's entering the conversation more and more right now. And what we're seeing is that some people have always been acquisitive, of course, to add new products or services or geographies, like the standard reasons you might pursue an M&A activity. But now we're seeing people as saying, hey, we really need additional human resources on our team. And if we could buy a turnkey business unit and just bolt that into the mothership, that's actually more attractive than trying to hire new talent, which is just becoming increasingly challenging.
Is that what they conventionally call acqui-hire, I believe, right? Acquisition focused on hiring?
Exactly.
Kind of riffing off of that then, Garrett, completely with you on the uncertainty of, let's say, less experienced. I don't want to say less sophisticated, just less experienced transaction participants. Do you tend to see, is there a shared level of uncertainty that's consistent across first-time buyers as well as first-time sellers, or is that anxiety and uncertainty more focused on the buy side? Because I tend to experience a lot of exuberance and excitement folks entering the sell side, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are there.
I would say on the sell side, the uncertainty of the process. I think if people approach our firm and say, look, we're interested in selling our business, I think they understand more or less the steps. It's not hard for them to get their minds around a controlled auction process, okay? What's probably the single biggest uncertainty is valuation. I mean, that's the question people hit on time and time again. And as we go through the process, they want additional information as to why bidder A bid what they did versus bidder B and so forth. And of course, we try our best to break down the bids and see how we can leverage one into the other. But I think for sellers, they've generally reached a pivotal time where they've decided if they're selling their entire business, and specifically if it's a family business, that this is going to happen. It's just a matter of what's the numbers going to be. So their apprehensions or nervousness are different. When it comes to the buy side, it's really hard to sort of say, I mean, you might be shopping for a very specific looking asset, but it's hard to say if that asset is actually available in the market. You might have to take a variant and you'll get 80% of what you want, but you're not really going to get the exact item you maybe are shopping for.
Interesting. Another follow-up then, and for folks on the sell side, what is your recommendation in terms of lead time? How early would you like to be speaking with folks that are looking at a potential exit in service of them getting the best possible exit? Are we talking months, quarters, years? What would be your guidance there?
It's an unrealistic expectation, and in fact, it's never happened in my 15 years doing this. But in theory, I mean, if you could 3 years ahead of a targeted sale, if you could start preparing for that sale, there's a lot of things you could do, I think, as sellers to just make the process go smoother and potentially maximize the valuations. But that's generally not always the way things work. More common than not is that someone comes and says, we do want to sell and we want the process to begin here and now. And if that's the set of circumstances, we're limited in terms of maybe what we can do to fill voids or make repairs to the business internally. But sometimes at a minimum, we'll say, why don't we spend the next 3 months really preparing all the contracts, getting data rooms ready to go, so that at least that part of the process isn't unnecessarily encumbering when we get there in the midst of multiple bidders. It just becomes too chaotic.
Sure. Okay. Thanks. So then kind of panning back again, when we think about the ag supply chain, which is really where both Verdant and our business here, we focus exclusively. What do you think? And this might be tough to answer because we're really focused on this sector, but what is your perspective on what might make ag supply chain businesses unique in terms of strategy and M&A?
So I had a breakfast with a gentleman who came from the software industry earlier this year. And he told me something that I think I already knew, but I'm going to give some credit here to this person. I won't name his name, but he said, my entire life I've spent in the high-tech software industry. I have never seen a supply, and now he's spending time investing in agricultural companies. I need to add that caveat. He said, now I've never seen an industry so disjointed as agriculture. And at first I was mildly offended, but then I thought about it and I said, he's absolutely right. And this idea that it's almost, to use a football analogy, American football, if you have any international listeners, it would be like having an offensive team specific to, taking the ball from the 20-yard line to the 30-yard line. And then you bring in an entirely new unit, offensive lineman, quarterback, everything, to take it from the 30 to the 40, the 40 to the 50, and so on. And it seems like that's the way that the barriers in agriculture have been built. Each one is extraordinarily capital intensive. So if you're an inventor of crop genetics, let's say, you have huge R&D costs. You're spending, as largest companies are spending billions of dollars a year to breed a better, more superior genetics. The next stage in the value chain, let's say the seed goes to the farmer, they have individually millions on an individual level, millions of dollars of land, equipment, and so forth. And they're highly specialized. And then, you continue down that value chain. It's very disjointed. And so the complexity in ag is that trying to be holistically united and fully vertical. This idea of being a fully vertical company in agriculture, really it's just you're fully vertical in the segment you're in. So if you produce seeds, as an example, you might breed the seeds, produce the seeds, sell the seeds, but you don't grow the seeds in terms of the commodity grain. You don't gather the grain, crush the grain. I mean, there's been virtually the only exceptions to that rule are very small acreage niche crops, but commodity grains and so forth, it just doesn't exist. So I think that is the single biggest differential maybe in the agricultural marketplace. It maybe just doesn't quite exist as much with other industries.
And then natural to assume that that kind of disjointedness, that fragmentation, frankly, that complexity that creates opportunity then from an M&A perspective.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I've always had the opinion that when people try to move backward or forward integrate, I mean, it can be a great strategy, but it can also be maybe a reality check needs to happen there. And you need to realize that, just to pick on something, one of the large grain handling companies around the world, the so-called ABCD companies, they've historically not attempted to be in the farming enterprise themselves, and certainly not the breeding and crop genetics. There's been examples where they have been, but there's also been a lot of examples where they've since divested of that asset because they just realize we can't be world-class at the entire agricultural value chain and the continuum.
Great. Super interesting. So as you look out for the next 3 to 5 years in the crystal ball that I know you keep next to you on your desk, and controlling for the current uncertainty, but looking over the longer term, what role do you think M&A is going to have? And by that, I mean, do you see deal value or deal volumes picking up? Do you see activity pace slowing down? Do you see specific sectors that are going to be white hot where others no one's going to touch? Kind of what are you seeing as you look a little bit further afield in the next 6 months, let's say?
Sure. Well, I was formally educated as an economist. And so if I was an economist, I'd maybe give you a series of factors that could potentially thwart M&A volume and activity. But now as an M&A advisor, I'm always sort of perennially optimistic about there's always going to be deals. And, we've seen a lot of ebbs and flows through the years, changes in appetite for different crops or different portions of the value chain that, become 1 minute they're in vogue and the next they're not. And so the door seems to swing open and swing shut quite frequently. The one thing I would say is that innovation, whatever that is, continues to bring new opportunities. And the companies that have been most acquisitive in agriculture generally are the blue chip, bulge bracket size companies. So they have the most money and they have the most capability in terms of they have dedicated M&A teams that wake up every morning thinking about, well, what's the next deal we're going to do? And so those companies are really good at, I would say, the post-development stages or the development and commercialization stages. But the innovation stage, that's still really a vibrant area for small. I mean, you could be a backyard developer or create something really interesting out of your basement or your garage. That still exists today. So as that innovation continues to come to light, M&A will continue to exist as far as I'm concerned, just in terms of achieving and obtaining those innovative step change technologies.
Interesting. So kind of thinking about that, so there's obviously going to be some opportunity rich aspects of the value chain. Then there might be some areas that are also not opportunity rich in the aggregate, but for individual players do seem to fit their strategy very well. And I don't know if you get into this much in your work or not in terms of assessing strategic fit or alignment of a deal to a client's business. But I guess first question is, do you do that kind of work and provide that perspective to your clients? And then even a bigger question is, how do you go about assessing if you think a potential acquisition should even be pursued? Because that's a question that sometimes doesn't get asked enough. You get deal momentum, you get people to get excited about it. They want to do a transaction. They can't imagine not doing a transaction. And so from your perspective, how do you even look and say, hey, this makes sense or doesn't make sense?
We, as you touched on when you introduced us, Joe, the business has been around for 25 years. And for 25 years, we've worked to build a world-class reputation. And we want to be thought of as a group that puts together opportunities and deals that really transform the industry for the better. And we want our clients to be really excited and happy about the outcome. And so I start with that introduction to my answer, because if we were industry agnostic, we could come in and break apart companies or suggest acquisitions that make no sense. But the reality is, we don't have to live with the acquisition in the same sense that let's say, a buying company would. But it's very important to us that the acquisition is well thought out and well executed on it and everything, and it goes really well. And so, at the next quarterly board meeting or the annual board meeting or whatever that next iteration where they're revisiting this acquisition and they're looking at performance figures and so forth, and did it make sense strategically? We really want the answers to be, everyone smiling and thumbs up around the room. Failure to do that, it's the adage of, well, we came in and we executed once and we got paid, but we're probably not going to be getting invited back to the table, because it's just the experience the customer had and that the client had was not a good one. So I would say to you, it's incumbent, a very long-winded response, but it's incumbent upon us to be objective when it comes to an acquisition, not just looking at the dollars, but looking at the fitment. And our team is built from industry, former industry executives. A lot of the people on our team come from that pedigree. So they are very well indoctrinated in the industry and know what is and is not a good fit. And so that's where I would say we aren't going to say yes to everything. And we're going to try to shape. And in some cases, we have relationships with maybe the people at the target company they're looking to acquire. And we might actually have some opinions as to whether or not that's one to avoid.
I think that's noble that you also would even raise that, because in the short term, arguing against a deal is arguing against your own commercial interests, right? I mean,
Exactly.
no deal creates no project creates no revenue for the firm. And so I think it's really important. I've certainly had that in the past couple of years. In one case, talked a client out of an acquisition at the price that was currently on the table, not because I'm a valuation expert, but because the price was making them uncomfortable, and things that we saw in the way the business was being operated gave me a lot of pause from an integration standpoint. How do you actually bring these two companies together? We also had a situation where we were engaged by a company looking to become an aggressive buyer in the market, saw some really compelling acquisition opportunities. But when we looked at the economics of how they were currently operating their business, the question we put to the board was, if you didn't own this business today, would you buy it? And that's a more important question to answer before you figure out who else do you want to go out and buy. And they ultimately decided to pursue an exit, not solely because of our input, but perhaps we validated something that was in the back of their minds, saying, if this is not working great today, maybe getting bigger, having more of it is not the solution. So it does take a bit of courage and putting some of your own interests, short-term interests aside. But I think it's well stated that the real value from the relationship comes when they look back a year later and they don't associate you with the stink of the deal, because the deal they did was actually a good one, and Verdant was a part of that. So kind of building upon that, though, let's talk about those situations where maybe you have a client who is really excited about a deal, has what the proverbial deal fever, right? They can't shake it. The fever doesn't break. The temperature just gets higher, and they get more feverish in the prospect. What are the dangers that you think deal fever presents to buyers in the market? And what does deal fever mean to you? How do you know if it's showing up?
Yeah, in the absolute of responses, I'd love to tell you we're only doing deals around here that are the win-win, the proverbial win-win, so everyone's happy. But as someone once said to me, the surest way to know that a transaction, on certain elements of a transaction, you're probably reached the fairness level, is when both parties are equally dissatisfied, right? That somehow means that compromise has been made. And because deals aren't one-sided, it takes two to tango. That saying is absolutely true here. I have never done a deal where one party wanted something and the other didn't. So if one party wants to transact and the other doesn't, that deal does not get done. It isn't, there isn't a 51% leverage that the seller can put on the buyer. It just simply doesn't work that way. So probably even more than deal fever, though, just as an interjection here, Joe, deal fever is probably more like the buyer having the deal fever, of course, right? Probably the bigger issue we run into as a firm, and maybe that's just because of the nature of maybe some of the family businesses but even corporate clients have this problem. It's deal fatigue. Deal fatigue is probably the single, and we're going to touch on that, I think, later in the podcast, but deal fatigue is almost bigger issue that we observe in the deal, which is just simply it takes too long. And it might take too long to get offers. It might take too long to get the due diligence done and get to closing. The negotiation of the definitive agreements might take too long. And sometimes people just lose their way. They just become disinterested. So I think that's also a huge encumbrance in terms of the risk of the deal.
That's interesting. I've not heard that sort of the paradox before of deal fever and then subsequently deal fatigue. Any thoughts on, is deal fatigue rooted in sometimes the processes take longer than they should, or is it really unreasonable expectations from the participants around how long an exit, for example, should actually take, or what is actually required to execute the exit? Is this an expectations issue, or is this just a process that's not as efficient as we'd like it to be issue?
I would say it has more to do with, let's say, maybe the buyer isn't moving as quickly as the seller would like. We get right, like day one, we're working with our firm, even pre-engagement, we're telling people what to expect. And if people say their expectations are that this is done and dusted in 30 days, I mean, as a firm, we won't take that relationship on. It's not practical. It's not realistic at all. So I think for us, we're very transparent that, look, we're not motivated to drag this process out, but you also must understand that there is a systematic approach. And if you want to trade value for speed, we can have that conversation if that's how you want to prioritize. But we think it's a hit to valuation to move unreasonably fast. But yeah, I would say generally more times than not, the deal fatigue part is just coming in the late stages of the deal. I mean, again, for a lot of people, they sell a business once in their lives, if at all. And so for them, it's just the mundane activity of due diligence is the one that tends to be the one that puts the most strain on the system.
For sure. Yeah. That's just the grinding nature of the questions, the requirements, the demands, all in the context of someone's really pointing at your baby and saying it's not as cute as you think it is, right? Which also becomes emotionally sensitive. I've seen that many times.
There are no ugly babies, as they say.
That's right. Well, I'd say, I'd say all babies are precious and some actually are ugly, whether we want to admit it or not, right? Not my children, of course, nor yours.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
Next question here. Any M&A deal, when we think about the long-term impact it would have to the business, has a wide distribution of outcomes from what we see in the business case or the deal thesis. And in my experience, it's not very often that you see a deal that actually exceeds the expectations in the business case. So usually that distribution of outcomes is to the downside, meaning it delivers something less than what was expected. And, of course, good integration planning and execution can improve the odds of delivering what was expected in terms of deal outcomes. But where have you seen deals fall short in terms of developing a realistic assessment of the expected value and then kind of leading to that letdown post-close?
I think that the hardest thing to assess in a deal is the cultural fitment of the company that's being acquired to the company that's the acquirer. And I think that's primarily related to two issues. One is companies that have senior executives that have been in the same company, let's say for 30 years, they don't understand that their culture might be different than other people's. They just assume, let's say, that every business runs just like theirs. And so maybe that's the decision-making process. Maybe that's just the general hierarchy of the company, the siloed nature of how employees are allowed to sort of maybe do collaborative work versus staying kind of in their lane. So that subtlety, you take them through due diligence. I've never been part of a diligence where, some sort of a psychologist or something comes in and studies people's working habits. That's never been part of a due diligence, and I'm not advocating that it should be. I've already told you due diligence is too long as we're looking at it now. But sometimes people don't understand that the interpersonal, the human nature of what they're buying. There's people here, right? I mean, sometimes it's a technology and a balance sheet. Okay. But if it's oriented around people, which most of the M&A we're involved in is, They have to understand that the dissatisfaction or the satisfaction is directly related to the culture of the company that they came from and they're going into. Some people might feel like it's a lift. Maybe some people like the rigid, more regimented version of the culture that they're going into in a larger enterprise versus the free-natured spirit of the family-owned operation. But a lot of people probably won't like that. And so I think when I think about that whole distribution of outcomes, is centered largely on the satisfaction of the employees that go with the company. And are they motivated? Because if they're not motivated and excited about the opportunity post-closing, the customers aren't either. I mean, we've all had experiences, whether it's at the shopping mall or wherever that is, a restaurant. When a person doesn't want to be there sitting across from you, helping you with the sale or whatever it is, that is a bad experience for the customer. So I think, to me, it's one of the things I observe that tends to not, that post-mortem 1-year checkup, when things are not going well, it has a lot to do with show me the employee retention, and then I can almost predict the customer retention from that.
That's a really interesting framework through which to look at the performance of the deal. What you said earlier too about people make assumptions after you've been in an industry or been in a space for a long time, and you've grown accustomed and comfortable to the way you all do your work at your company. It's hard to imagine anyone else doing it differently, right? Because it becomes so second nature. And we certainly see that quite a bit, where people are buying their long-term competitors, people they've been fighting with, and sometimes they have the boot on their neck, sometimes they have the boot on their own. But over time, that's the people they compete with. And there's this presumption that they're all doing the same services, bringing the same products, delivering the same value in the same way, until they're all sitting in the room together and they start to look at how does work actually get done. And that's how we define culture. So culture, you can go top shelf with a lot of pretty dense definitions, but we define culture as the way work gets done around here. And I think people make the mistake of, if they use the proxy of what work do we do, and if the work that we do is the same, we sell seed, we buy grain, we manufacture feed, we move milk from point A to point B, whatever it is, they mistake the work that we do for the way work gets done. And I think that also leads to a lot of that dissatisfaction. First, it's a surprise, then it's a frustration, and then it's just a wholesale dissatisfaction. So I can very much appreciate, and it's bringing back some painful memories as you're talking about that sort of gap. We've talked a bit about this, but I think it'd be good for us to spend a couple minutes just calling these things out. You do a lot of deals. You as an individual lead a lot of deals and manage a lot of transactions. You as a firm do many more. What are the recurring challenges that you are seeing that are preventing deals from getting done? And we also, we could ask, well, makes them not get done in a timely manner. I think we've already talked about that, but what's currently in the way of actually getting deals closed? Is it price? Is it value? I mean, valuation's a proxy of price. What do you see?
Yeah, if I had to categorize these at sort of a 30,000 foot level, because if you get too granular, you'll just end up with, the saying I think I've heard people say is, if you've done one deal, you've done one deal. And it just simply means that everyone is going to have its own nuanced sets of challenges. And we don't close every transaction we work on, unfortunately. So what gets in the way of those? Sometimes it's just no bids. Sometimes it's perhaps the reason for just no bids at all, maybe we'll break it down and we'll talk about it that way, is there could be a supreme concern with either supplier or customer concentration. So if a single supplier is 80% has 80% of the control, if you will, of the supply chain, and the value added component of the business is just taking it from point B to C, but the way they got from point A to point B was through 80% through one supplier, that is hugely limiting. Now, if the supplier that is this 80% supplier is the one doing the acquisition, then that's less of a concern. But in some cases, our clients say, gosh, we can't go to that person because if they find out about this, they might cancel our relationship and terminate it. And we said exactly the problem we're having. Buyers assess that same risk. And so that in itself, and then the same is true exactly on the other side of the business, which is the customer concentration, exact same sets of dynamics. If 1, 2, 3 customers make up 60, 70% of the business, and the risk of loss could thwart the whole investment thesis, buyers would probably assume either we don't do the deal Or this brings me into the second point, which you've already touched on, or we're going to pay a valuation that's so much lower because of that, that in turn blows up the deal or causes us. And so the first one is, we don't get we do not get offers because in this case, the company just has, let's say it's a discrepancy that cannot be overcome. Then reason two, a deal maybe doesn't close is valuation expectations aren't where we thought they should have been. And we, again, back to the realistic expectations around timing, we also have that conversation pre-engagement with our clients on value expectations. And to just use a simple, quick example, if our client thinks their business is worth 50 million and we can't see any realm of possibility where we could do better than 25 million, why subject ourselves and them to the brain damage and the fallout that's going to occur when we get to, let's even say it's a $30 million offer. It surpassed our best expectations for the deal and still be 20 million shy of their objective. It's a reality that we just simply won't pursue. And then the third, let's say, category. So we had just simply known deficiencies in the business we couldn't overcome. Then there's valuation. And then third is we overcome both of those. We do get offers. They are at the right value. The third thing that probably prohibits a deal from getting done is back to due diligence. And due diligence in the last certainly 5, probably more like 7 or 8 years has become something that just continues to grow and swell. And I've said this many times, and I understand why, but I think buyers are looking more for a risk-free deal. So they're looking and they're looking and they're looking and they're hiring more consultants. They're spending a lot more money on due diligence, frankly, because they want to head off risk factors that could be identified now. So, and I understand why that is, but the challenge with that is if any qualified consulting firm looks hard enough and far enough, they're going to find deficiencies. But are those ones that matter? Are they really something that isn't just baked in every business? I mean, if it's inherently part of the industry risk profile and a consultant says, you've got a risk here, isn't that, I mean, if you want to be in agriculture or food and you want to be in that specific area, you have to have already overcome the realities that there is risk in agriculture that are very nuanced, again, by which part of agriculture you're playing in. But it's just, and then it's another tie back to the deal fatigue. So instead of sort of saying, hey, let's get our arms around a 30 to 45 diligence, they're taking 90 days in some cases now by the time all the different groups can come in and conduct their analyses. And on our side, Joe, last comment here on this question, we as a Verdant Partners and as an M&A firm, there are certain things we can recommend to our clients that they do in advance to shorten that due diligence period. But 2 criteria have to be met. One is the deal has to be of significant enough size. So a $5 million or $10 million transaction, we're generally not going to commission a quality of earnings report to be done because it's so much money relative to the size of the asset that chances are that's not a valid expectation. It's not going to be an expectation of the buyer, and it's just not practical for deals that size. But then 2, there's always the chance that our clients simply aren't certain they want to invest that kind of money without the assurance that there's a deal to be made. And that's a risk. You could end up commissioning several $100,000 of due diligence reports that never get put to use if you don't get the offer you want. So that is a bit of the challenge as well and why it can extend that period.
It's a really interesting phenomena because you think about the last 5 to 7 years, and most recently was ZIRP or zero interest rate policy, and just overall longitudinally, just cheap debt. The low price of debt, which now maybe will carry a high cost for people who did bad deals on the back of cheap debt. But it's interesting how, despite lending costs being at historic and abnormal lows for so long, the expectations of a zero risk deal were also swelling at that same time. They seem divergent in a way that it doesn't need to be. I could expect now people looking for risk-adjusted returns, wanting to see risk-free deals because, frankly, the borrowing costs, the financing costs, those ROI hurdles are higher now than they've been in some people's professional memory. For folks that have been in the business for just 10 or 15 years, they haven't seen anything like this before. So I don't think we need to spend much time on that, but just interesting as I'm kind of digesting what you're saying, that despite the economic and the borrowing environment, people's expectations for risk-free transactions growing, it seems strange. But
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The challenge has been, I think, the lower interest rates drove up valuations. But because of that, people linked that also to, wow, we're now maybe valuing a $20 million asset at $25 million, right? So maybe just the low interest rates caused there to be more aggressive bidding happening. But in some ways, and I don't have a study or something that points to this, but in some ways, maybe they thought, well, we need to be more highly scrutinizing of this asset because now we're spending $25 million on it, right? Like it's almost like, and I don't think that's necessarily the realities of today. I think the realities of today is there was the good old days, whenever that was, of where M&A deals, we physically, and I can remember this, it was a long time ago now. It was in the early days of doing deals, but before virtual data rooms existed. You showed up on site with bankers' boxes and file folders and having copies of all the company's private confidential records. And you spent 5 days with a company, 5 days. And they took photocopies of what they needed. They went back, they filled out their reports, and realistically, 30 days, start to finish due diligence. And that's just not the norm these days. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I don't see it getting better. I frankly think that this is either the new norm or maybe AI is going to help get us out of this hole, right?
Just ask ChatGPT to do your due diligence for you. I mean, it's as technology made the opportunity for efficiency greater, we clearly didn't have static expectations. So as things got more efficient and you could do them from your home office, engaging people virtually, like you and I are here today, right? We're not sitting in the same room recording this conversation. We're states away. But as people were able to do that work more efficiently, it seems like as the efficiency went up, so did the expectations for information and that, the second, third, fourth level questions, et cetera. So we've talked a lot about some of the lessons learned, some of the things for sellers to watch out for. But I know that you have a really interesting framework and thought process around what well-prepared sellers know before they start to pursue the exit. And we'll remove for the moment the unreasonable expectations of them talking to you 36 months before they want to sell, right? That's ideal. That's great. Listener, do that. If you're thinking about a sale in the next 5 years, start talking to someone, Garrett or someone like Garrett soon. But let's remove that from the equation for a moment. But what are the things that you would want to highlight that you wish more sellers knew before they said, okay, start the clock, let's go?
One of the challenges here is the list I'm about to give you probably is the more like the years of preparation to get here for a lot of businesses. Now, with some, maybe the larger corporate clients that have in-house general counsel and so forth, like some of these or in-house HR, all those types of things, sure, these are well prepared and sitting on a shelf somewhere. But I've got about 6 items in my mind that I feel like are always the areas that get probed on the hardest. And maybe they're the single biggest limitations to going forward in terms of a process. And so if you can have some of these items well prepared in advance, you're just that much more ready for the sale process. So in no particular order, my list includes, the first one is just generally speaking, future-proofing your business. And what I mean by that is, I've heard many proprietors sit in a room and say, I built this business by myself, and today I run it very lean. It's just me and a few people, and we're super efficient, and on and on and on the list goes. And what the reality is, what a buyer's hearing is, on the one hand, congratulations, you put up your heart and soul into this, and you've accomplished a lot. But on the flip side, they hear, yikes, that's going to be really hard to transition this business from a sole proprietor who does everything to a team and an environment where we have to unpack that and integrate and incorporate that into the business. So, Joe, I would contest that makes your job a lot harder if you're working for a buyer for the integration, because the employees of that company are so used to being they receive commands and they execute. And so this idea that maybe they're not enabled to be more autonomous in their decision making as part of that culture, that's something that's really important. So this idea that, as the saying goes, if you were to get hit by the milk truck, does the business have continuity, or is that its last day? So that's the really important thing I think to be on the lookout for, is future-proofing the business. Secondly, and this is more just in general, but you'll never be more organized in your business than after you run an M&A process. You think about all the contracts, where do they exist? Well, they're over in that drawer, or they're on this server. but how well organized are they? And can you really go through and document, do you have all those material contracts, a signed copy, not just a copy, but an actual executed copy? Those are things that are really important. And then also going into organization is also just as you think about, I lump timing into this, is are you paying attention to the market dynamics a little bit here and when your business is maybe most desirable? And those two things kind of, I mean, they're unrelated, but they're also very closely related in the sense that if you're not well organized, it doesn't matter if the timing is right. But if you are well organized and you feel like there's an inflection point in the market, you can respond pretty quickly to it and put your business out there. Financial health and records, categorically speaking, is paramount. So the ability to have nicely prepared financial statements, that's great. But also, just the overall having just a pulse check on the financial health of the business. How much debt are you carrying? What's your KPIs, your key performance indicators in the business, such as sales per FTE or some of those other metrics that maybe it's just a good idea to do a comparative analysis and see, like, how am I doing? How did I do last year compared to this year? Simple things you can compare and contrast your business either to peers or just year to year. I think that's really important. And then also in that category is anything that's extraordinary, non-recurring, or let's say non-business related. These normalization adjustments are always part of every transaction we're involved in. And what you're trying to do is just throw out the things. And they can be atypical in the sense of it could be a one-time insurance payment. You had a loss of a building and you got paid $200,000. That's not normal operating course. So you're going to not get credit for that, if you will, on your P&L. The same would go as if you had maybe an employee lawsuit, something where an employee sued an employer for some sort of work-related matter, and you incurred significant legal costs or had to have a settlement or something like that. That's also not technically ordinary course. And so we would generally see add backs for those types of encumbrances. Intellectual property, to the extent your company has it, make sure that stuff is well documented. I mean, that's not something you should be doing, of course, just preparing for a sale. That's paramount to any business that's involved in IP-related matters, but really make sure that stuff's under lock. It will go under a microscope if a company is looking to acquire. It's not intended to be a self-promoting sort of a statement, but get your deal team ready. So, of course, yes, it's M&A advisors, but it's also your accountant. Make sure they're up to snuff and prepared to take an array of questions in a due diligence process. Deal attorneys are also very important. I mean, they're arguably one of the most important participants in the process because of their need to look out for your risk and your post-closing sort of situation of what is that going to look like for you. And so generally, these are highly specialized people. They aren't one-man attorneys or one-woman attorneys. They're like in a firm. They're generally a firm, 25 attorneys or 5,000 attorneys. I mean, they're generally larger scale, and they have the bandwidth to handle your M&A activities. And then last one is just, and this is something we want from all of our clients. We tell you in a contract, here's what we're going to do for you. But here's what we expect from them, our clients. We want commitment and we want managed expectations. And we've touched on both of those already in the cast, Joe. But we want people to understand this to us is a very significant and important process we're taking you through. We're honored to be representing you in the transaction, and we want your full engagement. And so I'm not talking about, I need you to answer the phone at 10 o'clock at night or something like that. I'm just saying we want to make sure there's a firm commitment in the sense that you're committed to go forward with this transaction, right? Because you alluded to this earlier, we don't get paid unless we are successful. And then part two is, of course, we need to make sure that you're not too busy running the business to be actively looking after the needs, because it's going to be like for a while running 2 full-time jobs, right, to try to sell or buy a business. And then lastly, in addition to that, the expectations, just be pragmatic and realistic on valuation and timing. We're going to give you our feedback. If you feel like we're out of line on that, you reserve that right in that opinion. But at the same time, like, just keep in mind, we do best if the client is successful, first and foremost, but also if the valuation is maximized on a sell side, for example. So we want the same thing you want. We're not trying to find the lowest offer. We're trying to find the highest offer in that case, let's say. But it doesn't come without the realities of knowing where the pitfalls are. And again, we do this day in and day out. So we do believe we have a fairly good pulse check on where the market stands.
So that's great. And two things I want to touch on there. If you think about the first four of those six that you shared, future-proofing your business, organization, organizing your business properly from a record standpoint and contract standpoint, your financial health and records and intellectual property matters. There's a perception that all the work that goes into buying or selling a business is incremental to the value of running it. But when you think about those first four, those shouldn't actually live separately from the way you run your business. Those actually make for a stronger business, whether you're looking to exit or not. And so I think it's always the right time to find a way to get your house in order, get your poop in the group, so to speak. So I think that's particularly important.
I would agree with your assessment fully on that, Joe. And then I would just, it's key to all growing businesses that they have to create a delineation between how much time are we spending in the business, right? Growing it and making it successful versus stepping back, looking from it from an outsider's perspective and saying, gosh, where are we deficient? And that test, I agree 100%. You don't have to run it daily, but run it quarterly or semi-annually. Just step back and say, where do I need? And maybe you need to add another person to the functional area that's looking after that part of your business. That can be another sort of key element of how you prepare your business for sale.
Yeah, very good. You're talking about realistic expectations on valuation. And I think there's a lot of parallels between the way owners value their business and homeowners value their houses, right? And everyone's familiar with the person that thinks their house is worth $1.2 million because the house that they say is the same house 2 blocks over sold for 1.1. And I know my house is nicer than Bob's house, so mine's worth more. And then there's a letdown because the realtor comes in and says, I think we need to list your house at 8.5 or 850,000 or whatever it might be, depending on the market that you're in. And I think it really behooves sellers and buyers, frankly, to engage the right experienced professionals, whether you have those people in-house if you're a bigger firm, or if you need to go outside the four walls of your business to get the right experts to come in and give you a valid, credible, and sober assessment of the value. And then really think about it, because also those people, particularly if it's a firm like Verdant, you're incented by the value of the transaction, of course, but you're also incented by getting the transaction done. And so a realtor who says, yeah, we can list your house for 1.2 and it's not going to move. But if we list it at 850, we might get a bidding war, and I bet you get north of $1 million. And you need to think about that and listen to those folks because they understand what happens. And I'll tell you, businesses, much like real estate, a business for sale, same as a house for sale, it ages like milk, not wine. The longer it's on the market, the less perceived value, because if there's been an auction with 0 bids 2 times over the past 36 months, and people get wind of that, there's a presumption that there's something wrong with that business. And maybe the only thing wrong with the business was what the owner thought it was worth. If you looked under the hood, you'd say, wow, this is turnkey. I can't not own this business. But if you've seen everybody else in the market pass on it time and again, there's a presumption that there's a reason. And so I think, engage your trusted advisors to help give you that perspective. It's always your right to reject it. There's always a realtor that'll list your property for whatever you want to sell it for. But at some level, you're not going to sell it. So,
yeah. And as a tactic we could take as an M&A advisor is we could overvalue businesses as we're pitching for the engagement and say, gosh, if that investment banker is only telling you it's worth 40 million, we think it's a slam dunk at 50 million. But then that goes all the way back to the reputational hazard. I can do that once per industry, right? Then that gets out that, hey, this guy sold us on this $50 million idea. He ended up getting us bids in the mid 30s. And then he was telling us that's a great deal. You should take it. How do I have that conversation with the client? I mean, it's very uncomfortable. And that's the cardinal sin, is the overpromise, underdeliver. That's what we as a firm just fundamentally do not do.
Fantastic. I love it. All right. So to kind of put a cherry on this, let's just take the entirety of this conversation and the work you do in summation. And I'd just like your perspective. Ag supply chain M&A. Are you bullish? Are you bearish? Are you indifferent? How would you sum up the space, the opportunity, and what's in front of us here?
Yeah, the perennial optimist in me comes out. So I'm always going to be bullish, rather, on this industry, because when I think about all of the world's needs, okay, and this is sort of a hypothetical, I understand that, but when I think about what do I need every morning when I wake up, you need food, you need shelter, you need the things that agriculture produces. And so I have confidence that the world is going to continue to need innovation, and innovation, again, begets additional M&A. And so I think that there'll continue to be a lot of opportunities going forward in agriculture M&A. And, there's some industries that are highly consolidated, right? It's sort of already that rule of three. We've already gotten to 3 companies dominating those industries. But there's a lot of highly fragmented parts of the value chain. There's always, again, the new technologies and innovations coming. And, I think that's going to continue to drive this. And then furthermore, I love agriculture. At the front of the show, you said, I come from a family farm. This is near and dear to my heart. So I'm very passionate about ag. I'm a staunch defender of it, maybe to a fault. But you know what? Like, that's part of the chemistry I have with the clients we have, right? Is that they know I'm on their side, and they know I have the experience base that lends me to be able to have those discussions, go up against, if it's on a sell side mandate, go up against buyers who maybe want to poke holes through the logic in the theory. I'm pretty well versed in terms of how I can defend the strategies of the client companies. And then on the flip side, working on the buy side, Joe, I can also put on that a very objective hat and say, look, there are 10 opportunities out here, but there's only 2 that you would really want, in my opinion, to buy into to bolster what you have. So I think that's how I look at the ecosystem. And I'm always going to be bullish on agriculture, because unless AI creates a way for us to not need food, I'm pretty confident it's here to stay.
Yeah, I don't think OpenAI has a calorie replacement application yet for the LLM. But we'll see. Garrett, I had high expectations. So talk about high expectations from a sell side. I had high expectations for today, absolutely exceeded them on all fronts. And I really appreciate you spending so much time with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. It was great.
And I'm sure there's going to be some of our listeners that would like to get in touch with you to continue this conversation, maybe explore strategies that they're looking at, potential deals that they want to consider. So for those listeners that would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Probably the best way is to go to our website. I know that sounds a bit commercial of me to say it that way, but we put all of our contact information on the website. So my email is there. My direct line to my desk is on our website. That's pretty uncharacteristic of today's society, but you know what? We still feel like people hire us individually even more than they hire the firm, we think. And so that's the way we do it. So verdantpartners.com, and you can find all of our team's bios and information on there.
Fantastic. Thanks again, Garrett, for the gift of your time and your perspective. High value, and really enjoyed it. And thank you as also to our listeners for tuning in today. Before we go, I'd like to ask you to do the following, which we ask every episode. Share the Pacesetter Pod with others that you think could benefit from these types of conversations. I encourage you to follow or connect with me, Joe Mosier, on LinkedIn. As always, please visit us online at mosiercg.com, where you can set up a call or access some of our other resources to help you in the post-M&A integration challenges. And as always, this show is for you. And so we'd love for you to reach out and let us know what's on your mind. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about, what we need to focus on, so we can add value in helping you grow your business and execute strategy and get better results. Thank you for listening to the Pacesetter Pod, and have a safe day.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.